Reconstruction 1865 to 1877, the basics. Part 1. Reconstruction was the period following the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. It was a 12-year period in which the nation attempted to restore or reconstruct the shattered Union in social, political, and psychological terms. 3 questions had to be answered during this time period. What should be done to the defeated Confederacy, the South? What should be done for the freed slaves? There were about 4 million, that was the best estimate. And who should make the decisions about reconstructing the country? Should it be the President or the Congress? Most of the burden fell to this man, Abraham Lincoln, who was President of the United States at the time. At the time of the end of the Civil War, Lincoln was only 56 years old, but you can see by these photographs how the war had aged him. During his presidency, Lincoln had already put together a plan for the reconstruction of the Union. On January 1st, 1863, one of the first steps in that plan was initiated. On that day, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that a war aim of the Union, the North, would be to free the slaves. As a practical matter, the Emancipation Proclamation did not really free any slaves, but as a statement of what the future held for the Union war aims, it was an absolutely crucial document. Also, as the war came near to concluding, Lincoln had also proposed what came to be called the 10% Plan, which provided for a seceded state, a state that had left the Union, part of the Confederacy, to be restored to the Union upon the request of 10% of its voters in the election of 1860. Provisional governments were established under this rule in Virginia, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Arkansas. In Congress, among the more radical members of Congress, the radical Republicans, there was an additional proposal called the Wade-Davis Bill, which was more radical, but did not pass. These different Reconstruction plans were very much influenced by the results of the Civil War, an event that took place from 1861 to 1865. As you'll see on the following slides, the Civil War was a massive undertaking. For the Union, the North, there were 23 states with a population of 23 million, versus the Confederacy, the South, with 11 states, a population of 9 million, which included about 4 to 5 million slaves. The dead and wounded were enormous. The Civil War dead and wounded figures were the highest in American history for any conflict. If you take all of our conflicts together, from the American Revolutionary War all the way up to the present-day War on Terror, and combined all of their casualty figures, they would still be less than the dead and wounded figures for the American Civil War. And you can see the numbers here. For the Union, the North, the dead was 365,000, the wounded a little over 280,000. For the Confederacy, a death toll of 260,000 and an unknown number of wounded, but estimated to be at least 300,000. The combined totals for both the Union and the Confederacy were a death toll of at least 625,000 and wounded approaching 600,000. For the death toll, the combined totals for the Union and Confederacy, the death toll represented about 2% of the U.S. population at the time, and if we had the same percentage of our population today pass away, it would be a total of 6 million. And if you take the dead and wounded, it was about 1.2 million dead and wounded for both sides during the Civil War. And if you took a percentage of the population today that represents, which is 5%, the death toll would be in the millions. On March 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term. And at this inauguration, in the photograph shown here, Lincoln famously concluded his inaugural address with these words. It spelled out what his philosophy toward Reconstruction was predicated on. He said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. This photograph is a famous photograph of Lincoln's second inaugural. It's particularly famous because of the circles you see in the image. In the middle is Lincoln, of course, giving his inaugural address. But at the top, red circle at the top of the image, is an image of John Wilkes Booth, who would ultimately assassinate Abraham Lincoln. And in the circle just below Lincoln at the bottom are the conspirators who worked with John Wilkes Booth on the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War ended with the surrender ceremony at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, where Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant and effectively ended the Civil War. That was on April 9th, 1865. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and with it, the hope of a lenient Reconstruction toward the South also died. Lincoln was replaced by Andrew Johnson, his vice president. Lincoln was a Republican from the North, from Illinois, and Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from the South, from Tennessee. Andrew Johnson had gained fame during the Civil War as being the only Southern senator from the Confederacy who remained loyal to the United States. And so in 1864, when Lincoln was up for re-election, he chose Andrew Johnson as his running mate, so there would be a Republican president and a Democratic vice president, in order to show national unity. Now Johnson was president of the United States, and he endeavored to follow Lincoln's plan as much as possible, but also to provide some protection for his fellow countrymen in the South. Following the war, the United States Constitution was amended 3 times in a few years. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865 abolished slavery. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, which defines citizenship rights and equal protection under the law. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, which guarantees voting rights. The 13th Amendment, which is shown here, abolished slavery, which was one of the major war aims of the North and which was spelled out in the Emancipation Proclamation. Following Lincoln's assassination, the radical elements in Congress, the radical, more liberal party was the Republicans in those days. The radical Republicans wanted a more drastic policy than what Lincoln's policy or Andrew Johnson's follow-up policy were planning. However, Congress adjourned, and the Reconstruction policy became almost purely presidential Reconstruction under the direction of Andrew Johnson. While Congress was not in session, Johnson governments, as they came to be called, were formed in southern states by state conventions which drew new state constitutions providing for loyal white regimes and amnesty for all except former Confederate officers and some wealthy men, some planter class Southerners. The states of North Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, South Carolina, and Florida all formed what came to be called the Johnson governments, and they expected their elected representatives, who were almost all former Confederate leaders, they expected that when Congress returned to session, these elected officials from the South would be seated in Congress. However, when Congress returned to session in December of 1865, the Congress refused to seat, even to acknowledge, the newly elected representatives from these southern states. And at that point, Reconstruction passed into a new phase, in which it stopped being so much presidential Reconstruction as Reconstruction dominated by the Congress. In the second part of this lecture, I will be talking about Congressional Reconstruction and how it formulated the policy of Reconstruction for the rest of the time period affected through 1877.